Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think it's about time. So thank you all for joining. My name is Heidi Minzner. I'm a solutions architect on Dynamics 365 for operations. I know you might have seen April's name in the agenda and wondering where April is, for those of you that know her. April unfortunately fell ill, so nothing gets the blood flowing in the morning like, can you do a presentation this afternoon? But we have plenty of folks here from colleagues from Microsoft as part of the financials team, so not to worry, we'll get your questions answered. And thank you for joining today. So today we're going to talk about designing chart of accounts. How many of you are using Dynamics 365 for operations right now? Good number. Great. Implementation phase or? Wonderful. How about 2012? Good number. 2009? Okay, a good mix. So for those of you that are on AX 2009, a lot of the concepts might be new because we have done a bit of work in the area of chart of accounts, financial dimensions, and account structures. And so today's session, we're going to actually walk through creating a chart of accounts, how you can utilize a shared chart of accounts across multiple legal entities, and how you can use advanced rules to create rules that allow for additional financial dimensions in certain legal entities where additional financial dimensions might be required while still allowing you to share your chart of accounts. So looking at designing your chart of accounts in a way that it can reduce maintenance and still allow you to achieve the analysis that you desire off of those financial dimensions. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. So I think I covered this already, but before we get started, and I apologize, I'm not using the podium, I'm using a table. It's a little easier to demo from the table. This is just an example of that we're going to use throughout the course of the presentation on defining a chart of accounts and advanced rules that would match your corporate structure and reporting requirements. So here we have Contoso Corporate, and that consists of Contoso UK, Contoso Germany, Contoso Japan, and Contoso North America, which is also comprised of U.S. and Mexico operations. So in this organization, we have a shared chart of accounts across the legal entities, and we use a corporate chart of accounts for regulatory reporting. So we're just going to use this as an example as we walk through the different demonstrations, and primarily focusing on Contoso North America and how we can go through and create chart of accounts and satisfy rules that are required for Contoso North America. So you'll see this slide several times throughout the presentation. So first of all, with the chart of accounts, and I'm sorry, the agenda, we talked about this, but we'll cover what is the chart of accounts, how you can share a chart of accounts, how you can include financial dimensions, designing an account structure, designing an advanced rule structure, and then considerations you should have for financial reporting. So focusing on North America here are some of the requirements for Contoso North America. We use a standardized setup of main accounts. We require a balance sheet by business unit. North America also requires vendor and cost center to be tracked on all expenses, and all other revenue and expenses require business unit and department. And then Contoso analyzes their business by region. So these are the different requirements that we're going to go through, configuring throughout the course of the demos. So what is the chart of accounts? Chart of accounts is a list of main accounts. So by default, the chart of accounts is not associated with any legal entity. So you can create a list of accounts that can be shared across legal entities, and we'll go through and how you make that association for which chart of accounts is used by definition of the ledger. They can be shared across ledgers, and then you can have overrides at the legal entity level. So if there's specific main accounts that might be suspended or not or be inactive for a period of time, you can make those overrides at a legal entity level while still sharing your chart of accounts. We'll also take a look at the account category. And the account categories are important from a financial reporting perspective. It can really help reduce the maintenance of your financial reports if you're using the financial reporting as part of Dynamics 365 for operations, formerly known as Management Reporter, to set the context for those that are familiar with that term. All of our default reports for Management Reporter or financial reporting are based on that main account category. So if you're using the out-of-the-box categories, those default reports will produce data and work out of the box. If you make changes to your main account categories, there is some changes that you'll want to make to the report definitions just to ensure that the information is still pulling into the financial reports. And then we'll also take a look at utilizing templates to reduce the burden for creating main accounts as part of your chart of accounts. So again, we're going to go through this portion of the setup. North America uses a standardized setup of main accounts. And I'm going to take a seat while I drive the demo. For those of you, has everyone seen Dynamics 365 for operations at least? Okay, great. So this is our dashboard in operations, and I'm just going to, oh, I'm sorry. Guess I have to take this. For those of you that wanted to see that picture, I'm sorry, I have to go back to it now that it flashed up there. That's Tom Brady holding the Super Bowl trophy at the Patriots parade. It's a very fuzzy picture, but it's Tom Brady nonetheless. Okay, so I'm going to, I've saved favorites for the different forms that I'm going to go through, but just so you know the navigation, I'm just going to go into the general ledger area. And I'm going to start by just creating a chart of accounts. Now, this company that I'm logged into, it's a brand new company. All I've done is actually gone through and created number sequences. And I did do a little bit of setup on the ledger, but we're going to override that during the presentation. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create a chart of accounts. And again, by default, there's no association from the chart of accounts to a company, legal entity, or ledger. That's separate setup that we'll do on the ledger itself. And so to create a chart of accounts, again, it's a listing of main accounts. I'm just going to call this demo. And then I can start adding main accounts to this chart of accounts. We talked about using a template. So just to go through the exercise for one account, I'm going to create a new account from a template. I'll create one based on my accounts receivable template. And then you'll see some fields on this main account form are pre-populated based on the use of that template. So I have, my main account is starting with 13. That's the number series that I typically use for accounts receivable. My debit credit default is coming in as debit. I have my main account type set to asset. So there's some defaulting that can occur based on the use of the templates to reduce the setup for your main accounts. Now, on this form, I can also do legal entity override. So at this point in time, this chart of accounts isn't associated with any specific legal entity. So we'll come back to this. But basically, you can add in any particular constraints for a legal entity. So if this account is suspended in one ledger versus another, you can add that override on the main account itself. But we'll take a look at this in one that's already in use on a ledger, just calling it out here now. So I can go ahead and save this account, and then we'll take the rest of the time for this session to go ahead and build the rest of these main account lists. I'm just kidding. We'll use one that's already established. So that's how you'd go through and create a chart of accounts. It's very simple, and then you'd add all your main accounts to that chart of accounts. And of course, you can do this through data entities as well. You can import in the main accounts for your chart of account. I'm just going to go back to my full list of my full chart, and here I have a chart of accounts called Shared Chart of Accounts. And here you can see the full listing that we have. This is using Contoso demo data, but we have our full list of main accounts associated with this shared chart of accounts. And let me drill into one of these accounts, and then we can take a look at the legal entity overrides. So this particular chart of accounts is in use for multiple legal entities in the system. And when I want to do an override for one particular legal entity, I can add a row. And here you'll see the different legal entities in the system. I can pick a particular legal entity and then set some defaults for this specific legal entity. So you can have some information that's LE or legal entity specific. So if this account was suspended, I could mark it as such. If there are particular default dimensions that should be used for this particular account for this company, I could specify that in this section of the form. Marking this as suspended would remove it from any of the lookups when you're entering in transactions within the system so that it doesn't appear for that legal entity. So going back to the GL area, so we've created a chart of accounts. You associate your main accounts to the chart of accounts, and then you can also have overrides specific for a legal entity when you're defining those main accounts. I'm going to go into the ledger form. We'll come back to this form a couple of times. But here, again, I'm in my new company. If I go to the ledger setup, this is where you actually make the association for this company is using which chart of accounts. So here I've already selected that shared chart of accounts. We haven't yet defined account structures. We'll come back to that, but this is where you make that association. It's actually on the ledger. Currently, there's one ledger per legal entity. So this is where I'm making that association to that chart of accounts to use when I'm in the context of this company, Contoso North America. Okay. So we'll go back to the deck. So, yeah, the question is there a difference between legal entity and company? Today, they're one for one. So you would define a legal entity, and I can show you where you would define that in the system. But it's the legal entity that holds like the number sequences and whether it's used for consolidation purposes and basically the different statutory parameters that might be required for a legal entity / company. There's it is still one-to-one, yes. So next, let's take a look at financial dimensions. And I know even if you're using 2009, you should be familiar with this concept of financial dimensions. The difference between 2009, 2012, Dynamics 365 for operations is we now allow you to define unlimited number of dimensions. And then you can make an association or you create combinations of those financial dimensions through an account structure. And that's what makes those dimensions visible in entry forms such as the general journal entry. So financial dimensions can be custom. So you can create a custom list of values. For instance, we'll walk through creating an event as a custom dimension. And that is something that maybe you would tag on your travel expenses as an example. And you create the list of dimension values for anything that's custom. You can also create financial dimensions that are backed by an entity, meaning, as an example, customers. So if you wanted to create a financial dimension for your customers, that would be an entity-backed dimension where it's pulling the values from another entity in the system. And we'll walk through an example using vendor. And the financial dimensions are also shared across different ledgers. And just like with the main accounts, you can have or specify company-level overrides on your financial dimensions as well. So you can mark them as suspended or set active to and from dates on a legal entity level. You can create combinations of dimensions called a dimension set. And those sets are used for calculating balances for a combination of dimensions. Those of you that are using 2012 or Dynamics 365 for operations might be familiar with applying a dimension set on your trial balance list page. And then you can also define the order of your financial dimensions for financial reporting. And not only the order of the dimensions in the November release, we've also added the capability to specify which dimensions should be used for financial reporting. So in the past, all of them would integrate, and you could specify order. Now you can specify which ones actually integrate, so you're not carrying things into financial reporting that are not intended for financial reporting analysis. So in this section, what we'll take a look at is, again, the requirements for Contoso Corporate, requiring a balance sheet by business unit, and also that North America requires vendor and cost center to be tracked on expenses, and then all other revenue and expenses require business unit and department. So first we'll take a look at defining the financial dimensions, and then in the next section we'll talk about how those get brought together via an account structure. So probably have to exit again. So again, you'll find the dimensions set up in the GL area under Setup Dimensions. I've marked some of them as favorites, so I can easily navigate to them through my Favorites menu here. So the first thing we're going to do is set up the dimensions for vendor and, what was our other one? Cost center, correct? Cost center. So I'm going to go into my Financial Dimensions setup. And we have a message that we need to run dimension activation. So that's new in Dynamics 365 for operations. And so that's what makes the dimension available for use. So it's just a warning message. But I'm just going to go ahead and create the first one I'll create. In fact, I'm going to add an additional one besides vendor and cost center to show the custom dimensions. So we'll create our first one, a custom dimension of event. And so when I click on the lookup here, use values from, I'm going to choose custom dimension. And this allows me to name the dimension and specify all the dimension values that I intend to use. So we'll call this one event. And then here you'll see options for requiring this dimension to be balanced. So that is one of our requirements, not for this particular dimension, so we won't set it here. But I'm just going to save this, and then we'll create the dimension value. So at this point, we've just created the dimension itself. Now we'll create the specific values that we want to be available. So I'll enter Tech Conference as a value. I'm not sure that I can have spaces, so we'll take that out. And then here's where I can specify for the dimension value itself. Now this would be across legal entities, any of the values I set in the general section, the active to and from date. So if I'm going to be creating some additional values but I don't want them used yet, I can set them up in advance and then specify an active to and from date, so it would only be available based on essentially these dates. I can suspend a value, and this again would apply for any legal entity that might be utilizing this dimension in its account structure. For those values that are legal entity specific, that's when you would use this portion of the form, and perhaps this is not available for a particular legal entity. It works the same way or similarly to as it did on main account, where I could pick a particular company, and then I can mark this as suspended, for instance, in that company. So again, if the financial dimension of event is being used in an account structure for the DEMF company, this particular value would not show as available in the lookup based on its suspended state. So I'll enter just one more value. I think we'll get the point. And again, I want to put a space. There's other values here for creating totaling dimensions as well. So that's where some of these other parameters come into place. We also have this parameter, do not allow manual entry. So again, this could meaning that this dimension might be used, but it's used as a default dimension, and we don't want to allow the manual entry, but only its intended use when it's marked as a default, for instance, for a main account. Perhaps you always want a particular dimension value with a specific main account. And you can specify that on the main account itself, and then specify do not allow manual entry here to prevent that from being used with other main accounts as an example. So now that I have a couple values for my custom dimension, I'm going to go back and now add a dimension that is based on an entity in the system. And so I'm going to create one for vendors. You could see the different list of entities that are available to create as a financial dimension. I'm going to use vendors. And I'll save this one. And then if I go into the dimension values, this is where you'll see the list of all the vendors populate. I don't have to create the dimension values based on the fact that I've set this up for to be backed by our vendor table. I can see all the vendors that I have set up in the organization. So I'm going to go ahead and activate vendors. And you can run this as a batch process as well. And then I did not do this for events, so we will do the same for event. And I believe we already have cost center defined, so we won't have to go through that setup. This is not. Maybe. There we go. And then we'll just do the same for event. Now, event only has a couple of values, so this should activate much faster. And just to be sure, we already have cost center defined here. And cost center is an entity-backed dimension value as well. So you can define cost centers as part of the organization administration. And then we've just, this is part of our demo data. We have a financial dimension for cost center. So obviously I won't go through that setup. But the dimension values for cost center are shown and pulled from the cost centers that I've previously entered. So I'll pause there if there's questions. We're going to tie this all together with account structures next, but I'll pause, see if there's any questions on chart of accounts or financial dimensions.
Before you do the account structure,
yeah.
Go hit the business unit and the department are already set up here, right? Okay, so
oh, yes, I'm sorry. You're correct. So the requirements I had on the slide were business unit was applicable for all accounts. You're absolutely correct. We already had business unit defined here. Otherwise, we would go through that same set of steps. Thank you for calling that out.
Business unit is the balancing dimension that you were going to use.
It is, but it's not marked as such yet. So we can do that at the ledger level. Thank you for calling that out. So on the business unit here as well, I can set this to be require the dimension to be balanced, and then require the values for the dimension to be balanced. I'm sorry. I don't have it. Requires values for the dimension to be balanced with, and I don't have any others to be marked in this fashion, so it's not showing any in the list. But I'm actually going to set this at the ledger level, and then we can talk about how you define the inter-unit accounts. Yes. So thank you for calling that out. So we had business unit, we have cost center. We already have department. That's another requirement on our slide. These are all predefined. And to be specific, department, cost center, business unit are all entity-backed dimensions. So the same steps that I went through for creating a dimension for vendor would be applicable for departments, cost center, and business unit. Those are entities in the system that you can go and define values for, and then those values that you define as part of your organization administration populate as your dimension values when you're defining it as a financial dimension. Yes, question in the back. Yes, I'm going to actually come to that as part of the presentation. So the question was related to the financial dimensions for reporting and a change that was made in the November release, and could I elaborate? And I definitely will. It's towards the end of the presentation, but we'll get into that. Thank you. Okay. So now we have our, as called out, our business unit that was previously defined. We created a financial dimension for vendor. We already had a pre-existing financial dimension for cost center, and we already had a pre-existing financial dimension for department. So that now that we have these different financial dimensions, we want to create account structures and rules that would allow us to satisfy these requirements. So bringing the accounts and the dimensions together, we do that via account structures and advanced rules. Is anyone using advanced rules already? A few of you. Okay, great. Excuse me, the account structures can be used by, again, multiple ledgers. And as you saw on the ledger form, that's where we actually make the association of the account structure to the ledger. And then it provides the dimensions and accounts available for transaction entries. So after we go through and define our account structures and our rules and associate them to the ledger, we can take a look at how this affects transaction entry through the general journal as an example. And then we'll go through and define the rules to add dimensions to the original structure. So as the requirements read, business unit and business unit was required on all accounts, and revenue and expenses require business unit and department, and then just expenses, vendor and cost center. So those are the different account structures and rules we're going to define, and we're going to do this through creating two different account structures. One specifically for our balance sheet accounts, because the only requirement for balance sheet accounts is our business unit. And then we'll create a second account structure for our revenue and expense accounts that includes business unit and department. And then we'll use an advanced rule just for our expense accounts to add vendor and cost center, or vendor and event as the new dimension that I just created.
I have a question.
Yes.
Performance. If you were to have an additional structure, one for the revenue, which is business unit department, and then a separate one for expenses that would have vendor, cost center, business unit department, is there anything from a performance standpoint, if it's at the higher level versus advanced rule, do you know?
I don't think the question was related to performance, and would there be any difference in performance whether I had, instead of creating two for balance sheet and neither for P&L, if I actually created three, one for balance sheet, one for revenue, one for expenses. And I don't think there would be any performance degradation or improvement one way or the other. It's more around the maintenance aspect and in creating a single account structure and using the rules to help add the additional values versus maintaining multiple account structures. Yeah. Excuse me. So now we're going to complete this exercise by going through the account structures and the rules to satisfy these requirements. And like I said, in my example, I'm just going to create two account structures and use advanced rules on one of them to satisfy. So first I'm going to create my advanced rule structure just because I find it easier to set them up ahead of time. You can actually get to this navigation through the account structure as well. Dang it, sorry. It's displaying fine here.
Tom Brady's hiding. He just doesn't want to.
Okay. All right, there we go. So I'm going to go in and create an advanced rule structure first, and then we'll go, as we go through the account structure, I'll just reference the advanced rule structure that I create. So basically, this is just creating a hierarchy or the dimensions that I want to use through a rule. So meaning these dimensions won't be used every time I enter an account, but if they're, specifically in my example, I had vendor and cost center for my expense accounts. I'll create a rule or an advanced rule structure that contains vendor and cost center, and then I'll reference this structure just for my expense accounts when I create my actual account structure. I know that sounded confusing as it was coming out of my mouth. Hopefully, as we walk through it, it'll make sense. So I'm going to create a new advanced rule, and this one I'll just call vendor and cost center. And so at that point, I'm just giving it a name. And now I'm just going to add the segments that I want as part of this structure. So the first one I'll select is vendor, which I had previously created. And I'm going to add cost center as well. And I'm actually going to add, I know it wasn't part of the requirements, but I'm going to add event as well, just so we can see that the value coming through that I had just created the dimension values for. So in this example, I have vendor, cost center, event, and I have all values allowed. So similar to defining your account structures, when you're creating an advanced rule structure, you can also create specific combinations of valid values. So if for one particular vendor there was a specific cost center that was that needs to be used, you can easily create those rules in this form. The behavior is the same as you're defining your account structure. So you could actually put in specific values here for vendor 1001. It needs to be a specific cost center. Yes, question?
Is there any dimensions set at the master data level for inventory vendors, customers, etc. that trumps this, or is that concept not doesn't exist?
So the question was, are there default dimensions? If that's right, at the customer inventory main account. Yes. So you can still set defaults at the master data level. They would be used in combination with your account structures and advanced rules. So in order for them to even be available for transaction entry, they do need to be part of your account structure. Anything that a user might enter during data entry, for instance, on a main account, if you had a default dimension and it could not be overridden for department, for instance, and the user typed in a different value, when it posts, it will use the default that was assigned on the main account. Others in the room have any other comment on that?
These are basically valid values, not the default values.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Everyone hear that? This is defining the valid values, not the default values. You would still define any default dimensions on. You can still define any default dimensions on the entity itself: customer, vendor, main account, item.
Do these have to be defined one by one, or you can specify like a group of departments and this becomes valid for your corporate office departments, but not for your store location?
Yes. So the question was, I was starting to set this up one by one. When we get into the account structure, we'll see how we can do ranges. But any of the ranging that we have available, like I can do ... and 99999, for a range of vendors, a particular range of cost centers is available, and you can keep building out these rules. We'll look at this when we get into the account structure. In this particular example, the star or the asterisk means all values are valid. But you can certainly put constraints, and if you like using the cells, you can type in the cells, or you can actually use the bottom portion of the form to build out your criteria. So instead, I could say cost center is between and includes, and then I put in my values, and it basically builds the expression for me, so that I don't have to know that is represented as 20.30.
You got to be careful entering that number because you can use file cards and they're not validated. So if you have a 6-digit account number, you put 7 digits in there. You know what I'm saying? These numbers aren't validated that you load in here.
That is true. But you do need to be careful for the validation. There is a validate action. What that actually validates is that you don't have overlap between your different values as you're building out your rows. And the reason for not having that validation is really for, as your main accounts grow or your departments grow, you add more values. You can put in constraints that would allow for that growth without you having to come back and modify your rules every time you add a new account or add a new vendor in this example. So I'm going to leave this advanced structure just as it is with all vendors, all cost centers, all events, and then we'll go into the definition of. I'm sorry. Thank you. Yes, we should activate this. No, there's another. There's another checkbox here. If you see further down, allow blank values. So right now it's saying all values are valid. If I want blank to be valid, I would mark this checkbox as well. I've activated this, so I would put this in draft or edit it, and then I could mark blank values are allowed. We can do that. So now for vendor, it'll allow blanks. Or I can do the same for cost center. So it is an additional checkbox for blank values being acceptable.
So if you go and change the cost center after you initially say that, does it just go from that point when you change it? So if you say vendor A goes to this cost center, and 6 months into it, you want to change how you're looking at it, would it just start at that point and going forward in that cost center, or would it go back and change all cost centers?
Yeah, okay. Yep, the question was if I had a change, and I did have a specific association, so if I may, and correct me, if I have vendor 1,000 and I say cost center 22 is the only valid value for that vendor, and I've been doing transactions, and now 6 months goes by, and now I want to say the only valid value for that vendor is for cost center is 30. Will it go back and change any previously entered transactions? Is that the question? It will not go back and change any previously entered transactions. It would be from that point forward, the effective date of that relationship. I think my old one's still active. We'll delete the draft to make sure. Thank you, though. I could have you guys come up here and do the demo. So I'm just going to go into, so I've defined my advanced rule structure. Now we'll see where we can actually utilize this. And we're going to create new account structures. So I'm going to go into configure account structures, defined in the navigation. This is under chart of accounts and structures. I just have it marked as a favorite. And I'm going to start by creating a new account structure, and we'll call this one Tech Conference Balance Sheet. And by default, I want to add the main account, of course. So we'll create that, and then we'll start defining when we want this particular account structure used and the financial dimensions we want part of this account structure. So it's the same experience as we saw in the advanced rules. I'm going to add a segment because business unit was the dimension that we want used for all accounts, whether they're balance sheet or P&L accounts. And then I could start specifying criterion. So in this case, for my account structure for balance sheet, this is only going to include my main accounts. I'll enter a range 1,000 to 39999. As I know, those are my main accounts that comprise of my balance sheet accounts. And then if I had any specific criteria for which business units this was applicable for, I could enter that as well. If I want to allow for blank business unit, I can specify blanks are allowed. So this one is a very simple setup. Again, this account structure isn't yet being used by any legal entity. We still need to go and make that association to the ledger. But before doing so, I'm going to create a second account structure, and then for my expenses and revenue accounts, and then we'll see how that advanced rule is utilized. So I'll activate this account structure. And by the way, if you do have to make changes to your account structure and you already have one active, so in this case I've activated this account structure. If I needed to make changes to it, when I put this in edit mode, my previously activated account structure will remain active until I activate the draft version, the next draft. So we'll create another account structure. Call this P&L. And I'm going to add, again, I'm going to add business unit. The other segment we wanted for expenses and revenues was department, so I will add department. And then I'm going to specify a range of my main accounts here. Again, I can create rules for particular business units, departments for use for particular main accounts. Again, I would just do that by adding another row. So for instance, let me just put in some values here and then we'll clear it out. If I only wanted those particular business unit and departments used for a particular main account, oops. You can get very specific in your rule criteria. As an example, and then we can validate. And now I was getting those warning messages because I had some overlap between my different rows for my account structure. But as you build this out, you can get very specific, if needed, for which values are used. And this could be a range, doesn't have to be a single value. Here are all your different operators that you could include when you're defining the combinations. I'm sorry? So the question was, would this have impact on performance? Through the activation, it might take a little bit longer, but I guess just best practice would be to try to use ranges as much as you can where it makes sense. Because again, from a maintenance point of view, if you do very specific values like this and then you add a new value, that would require you to come and make edits to this to be inclusive of the new values. So if you can use ranges, if you're, depending on your requirements, it would be best to do so just because it would prevent you from having to do maintenance later. I see some nodding, so. So I was just doing this as an example, but yes, you can do ranges here. The only requirement is you cannot have overlaps across your different row sets because in order to validate against the account structure, it does have to be, we can't have overlaps between the different rows for validation purposes. We need to ensure that we have the specific criteria or we're looking at the right level of validation. So there's no overlaps between these rows, and you'll get warnings if there is overlaps, and you'll get errors when you try to activate if overlaps exist. The same will be true when you make the association of these account structures to the ledger. That same validation will occur to ensure that there's no overlaps between the different account structures you associate to your ledger. So I'm going to, let me just remove these. Yes, I want to remove. And I'll go back to my specific requirements. So now I have business unit department in use for my expenses and my revenues. Now I want to add the advanced rule structure for just my expense account so that I also capture vendor, cost center, and event. So I can add my advanced rules. So up at the top you'll see the advanced rules. And I'll add a new advanced rule to this account structure. I'm going to specify the criteria that I want this advanced rule structure to be applied. So in this case, it was just my expense accounts. So I can say when the main account is between and includes, and we'll do 5,000 to 6,999.9. So this next structure will only be applied when the main account values are between this range. And now I can add that advanced rule structure. So the only reason I went ahead and created this ahead of time was so that we could just select it here. Otherwise, you can create an advanced rule structure by navigating to that form from within the account advanced rule definition. So again, for these main accounts, this advanced rule will be applied and will capture 3 additional dimensions for our expense accounts. So going back to my account structure, I'm going to activate this. By the way, for those of you that are using AX 2012, obviously the display looks very different than what you might be used to. It was very graphical in AX 2012. And so moving to more of a grid fashion here does have some benefits. Such as you can use Excel in the data entities to create your account structures and your account structure criteria, and having a little bit more flexibility in how those are created. So one thing that sometimes trips people up when they're moving from 2012 to Dynamics 365 for operations is the account structures were hierarchical. So you would create your top level node and then add the additional criteria below it, where in Dynamics 365 for operations, like I said, you cannot have any overlaps. So each row is its own specific criteria. So just to keep that in mind if you are moving from AX 2012 to Dynamics 365 for operations, you have the same capabilities from the standpoint of defining those relationships. It's just, this is not a tree. These are individual rows with specific criteria, if that makes sense. Just from a visual point of view, the tooling that we had previously, we could not make use of moving to the thin client, and also based on feedback for the entry of those account structures. Having the ability to use Excel was pretty high. We got a lot of feedback on that. And so moving to more of a grid pattern allows us to make use of Excel and the data entities for bringing in that information.
For this reason, we had to remove the hierarchy.
Yes. Yes, because each criteria is each row is the specific criteria for the combination that's created versus a top-level main account, for instance, with all of the specific criteria underneath it. We just basically collapsed it in a way that that main account is specified now on each of the criteria to be able to bring in the information more easily based on less number of tables than perhaps it might have been in the past.
Probably for performance reasons as well.
I'm not sure if it was performance related. I don't recall. No.
Is there a limit to how many structures you can have? In 2012 you had a limit, and deleted structures also counted as used.
The question is, do we have a limit on the number of account structures? I'm going to look to some of my friends on that one. I don't believe we have a limit.
I don't think there's a limit to the account structures, but there's a limit to the number of dimensions in a single account structure.
I want, yeah, from a number of dimensions in a single account structure, I think that's true. It's 12. I have not seen, because right now the account structures aren't really, until they're associated with the ledger, they're not even being used. And that is a little bit, we made some changes in 2012. I forget which release it was, but initially when you created the account structures, you were associating them, I believe, at the chart of accounts level, right? So there were some changes that happened there, and I'm not sure if that posed a limitation previously. But now they're defined at the ledger level, so instead of the chart of accounts level.
Grab a card if you have them.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, definitely.
We've never counted anyone who's ever hit the limit on any scenario to date.
It was just because it came up to the customer of mine with not just two structures in our company, but quite a few different structures because they have a lot of dimension and you don't want to tap through all the dimensions. So you make more structures for one.
Yeah, I don't think we have a limit to that. It's just the
And they have
dimensions
8
that are within
companies,
the
so
account
yourself,
structure.
you're quickly at the limit there.
Right.
I have a second more important question. When you work in here with that, and suddenly you say, business is grown, now we want to start to work with sites.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to put in site in all my account structures. So today, when I say today, I mean 2012.
Yep.
Today, I have to enter all my periodic journals new. Today, all my purchase orders, at least those where there has been a delivery at the point of time where I changed my account structures, they're broke. They don't work anymore. I can't do an invoice. Is it better now with the changing account structures regarding how many dimensions I have in the account structure?
So just to make sure that I understood and everyone heard. So in the past, you would create an account structure. You've entered transactions. They're partially complete based on the document life cycle, right? So you might have a receipt, not an invoice, as an example. And then in between that receipt and invoice, you add another dimension to your account structure. And it's causing issues today. Are you getting errors? You can't post.
An error message. Get an error message. Doesn't it say that it's related to the previous account structure, doesn't it?
That's one scenario. Another scenario is that it posts. It looks as if it's posting, but it's posting everything on this different account. You have nothing in as material value, but you have something posted in finance. So you have a discrepancy between
When it does a
ledger
reversal
and
of progress,
Yeah.
it puts it in as
material.
Yeah, I don't know that there's been any changes in that regard in Dynamics 365 for operations, so we'll have to follow up on that one specifically.
Yes, because it's a big problem that you cannot change an account structure
Yeah.
after you have
Yeah.
gone live.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's
Yep, okay. Good point. Thank you. Okay, so now we have our account structures, and we have our advanced rule associated with our profit and loss account structure, and it has been activated. So the final step in being able to utilize these account structures for this organization, the new company that I created, is to make that association for those account structures on the ledger. So we had already associated our chart of accounts. I had previously selected my fiscal calendar for the ledger as well. And then here is where I add my account structures for this ledger. So I'll just select the two that we created. So now I have my two account structures associated with this company Contoso, North America, and just to see the impact to ensure that our rules are applying correctly. I'm going to go in and create a general journal just so we can see how this would present itself in transaction entry. So I have a journal that I've already created. I'm just going to start adding lines to this journal. And now in the account structure, if I were to enter an expense account, now I can see the different dimensions that are available for entry. So again, the expense accounts are the ones that had the most number of financial dimensions. The business unit coming through from the account structure that we created, the department coming through from the account structure. We had vendor, cost center, and event through that advanced rule definition that we added to the account structure. So this lookup is a bit different than it was previously as well, where it will show you the definition for each of the financial dimensions and present those that are applicable for the main account that is entered. So you'll have lookups for each of these as you go through the different values and so on.
Do you see a difference if it's mandatory or just available?
The question was, do I see a difference if it's mandatory versus just available? You would still see the red squigglies in between the different dashes, your delimiter. So you would still see that. That would be your indication that it's required. I don't have any of mine marked as required. I'm sorry?
Which dimension will it be visible for the customer or vendor that I create the customer? Because this is only the requirements for GL.
This is the requirements for transaction entry. When you go and create default financial dimensions on a customer or a vendor, you'll see all of the financial dimensions that have been defined, and you can specify defaults. We'll go into the customer form. Oops. Excuse me, I don't have, this is a brand new company, so I don't have any information. Let me go to one that does. So in this particular organization, so yes, it's using a different account structure here. So that's why we're seeing we have business unit, cost center, department, item group, and project. These are the financial dimensions that are associated with the account structure. I changed companies here just because I didn't have any customers specified in my brand new company. But to confirm, we can go to the ledger for this organization to look at the account structures. And you'll see for the P&L, if I just drill into this, we can see the different dimensions: business unit, department, cost center, item group. And it might have an advanced rule for project. So that's why those dimensions. So it is limiting to the active dimensions for the account structure associated to the ledger. I'm sorry? It would be a combination of the dimensions on any account structure for the ledger. Yes. I'm just going to switch back to my other company that I had. So we made our association. We were looking at the GL entry. I was just going to change the account number on that GL entry so we could see the change in financial dimensions based on the account selected. So if I clear this value and then I type in a balance sheet account, and then click the lookup, I only see business unit because that's the only financial dimension associated with my balance sheet accounts. So just to show you how the impact of the account structures and the advanced rules will be reflected in transaction entry. And then the last piece here is just related to reporting. I know we only have 15 minutes.
Did you want to mention the business unit balance and financial dimension?
Thank you. Thank you. So if I go back to the ledger, everyone's keeping me honest. Thank you. And there is one, yep, I'm going to delete this. Can't save it. Okay. We'll go back to the ledger. So here on the ledger, I can also specify that balancing financial dimension. So we talked about this earlier, and it was part of the requirements for the organization. If we want to ensure the balancing financial dimension, I can specify which financial dimension, and that's, in this case, it's business unit. And so that will ensure that if I'm entering a transaction and it's for business unit 10, we'll have corresponding balancing entries for that business unit. There is additional setup that would be required for this, and that's part of the inter-unit accounting. So if I save this on the ledger, the one other area, thank you. The one other area I need to go to is the accounts for automatic posting or automatic transactions. This is part of your ledger setup. And if I create a new one here, I have a posting type of inter-unit. So I have inter-unit debit and inter-unit credit. I just want to specify the main accounts for both of those. And so whenever, that will ensure that when the transaction is posted against business unit, it will create either the corresponding debit or credit to the account that you specify here in the posting setup. Thank you. Yes, exactly. So one would get the debit account, the other would get the credit account with 20 and 10 to offset each other to ensure a balanced balance sheet by that financial dimension. So one thing to call out for reporting, and let me just go back to the slide. The last one was reporting by region. And this is where we can take advantage of either the organizational hierarchies in Dynamics 365 for operations, or we could just create a reporting tree in Management Reporter so that you can get to the different levels of aggregation. So the reason we call this out is it's not always necessary to create a financial dimension to do aggregations and roll-ups. You can make use of some of the capabilities within the reporting tree definition within financial reporting to accommodate some of your analysis. So in this particular instance, if we had an organizational hierarchy reflecting this structure, we could use this in Management Reporter / financial reporting as a reporting tree, and we'd get the aggregates at this level without having to create another financial dimension that has to be stamped on every transaction. So I mentioned that I would show you the new setup, and then I'll just take a quick look at a reporting tree that uses an organizational hierarchy, just so you can see how you could make use of that in financial reporting. So there is a new setup, and that is under the ledger setup, financial reporting setup. So this is a change. If you remember in the past, we used to have, and we still have, an option for financial dimension configuration for integrating applications. That's where you used to find the financial dimensions, and you could change the sort order for use for management reporter. Now we have this option, financial reporting setup, that's under ledger setup. And this is where you not only specify the ordering, but which dimensions you want to flow into financial reporting. So there was a slight issue on my machine here. Main account should always be selected, and you should see that by default. But any additional dimensions that you want to add, you can specify business unit, department, and then you can change the order of these dimensions as well. So if I really want department to show as the second segment, I can reorder. Now, one thing to call out here, I'll also call out the attributes, so let me talk about that first. There are additional attributes that you can specify to include for financial reporting as well. And this is vendor and customer. And what that allows for is if you're looking at a detailed report, like a detailed trial balance, and you want to see the vendor or customer associated with the ledger entry, this will allow you to add an additional reporting attribute of customer or vendor so you can see that information on your financial reports. These options did exist in the past. They were just kind of hidden in a configuration file. So it wasn't very discoverable. Now you can set this through the user interface. One thing, if you do make changes to this information, you do need to reset your management reporter data mart for it to pick up the new settings. It would get them going forward because it would be integrating in the past, but any future, if you wanted to, if this was set to no, for instance, previously vendor, and you wanted to start including that, you would want to do a data mart reset. These additional attributes are at the financial level, general ledger level. So if I'm looking at a trial balance report and I drill through on accounts receivable and I want to see the customer associated with all those transactions that make up my accounts receivable balance, that's when I would use. Same on accounts payable for vendor. And then the last thing, well, I've been letting this sit, so let me refresh. I'm just going to go into the report designer and just show you how you can make use of the organizational hierarchies for the financial reports as well. So again, this is getting to the requirement of I need to report by region, but I don't have that as a financial dimension. Oops, that's not the right one. There's too many environments. So I'm just going to select one of the existing default reports. I just have the audit details. I mean, you could pick a balance sheet. If I wanted to view this information, actually, let me pick the income statement. And by default, none of the default reports will have trees, but you can create a reporting tree, or you can use an organization hierarchy as a reporting tree. So if I select organization hierarchy, then I'll be able to see all of the hierarchies I have set up within Dynamics 365 for operations. And I could pick, for instance, that Contoso holdings. And if I view the tree, this is the tree that's based on, my roll-up of legal entities. You can see, based on my definition that I have in my org hierarchy, I have several, a couple of legal entities rolling up to one level and then to the overall group level. So this would be a way of getting to additional analysis without having to create more financial dimensions or financial dimension values. This was based off an org hierarchy, but you can also create your own reporting trees. And I'm sure we have lots of sessions on financial reporting. In fact, a lab coming up right after this session on financial reporting, if anyone is interested in joining that. So this was just as an example, you can, instead of, our legal entities are basically set up by region in this simple example, and we have 2 of them rolling up to North America. So you could use those reporting trees to do the grouping of your legal entities to get to the summary balances for each of your regions without having to define another financial dimension for it. And so some of the things that we have like 5 minutes left. Sorry, I could not time myself today. So some considerations if you are moving from a previous version is take a look at the design you have today, and is there opportunity to make some changes going forward that would help reduce the maintenance that you might have, taking advantage of the rules, ranges in the rules and ranges when you're defining your account structures. The 2009, as called out here, the 2009 set rules, when you do an upgrade, they upgrade as advanced rule structures in Dynamics 365 for operations or in AX 2012. And then dimensions created as custom financial dimensions and values are shared across companies. All the dimensions are shared across companies, with the exception of those entity-backed dimensions, which do have their legal entity association. But for instance, if I create a financial dimension of vendor, that is available for all legal entities, but when I'm in the context of a specific legal entity, it's obviously only going to show me the vendor list for that company. So with that, we have a few minutes for questions. I thank you for your time. Sorry I'm not April. Hope you still found value. And thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. But me and my colleagues will hang around, too, if you have any questions afterwards. And I know we have some follow-ups, so we'll try to get some Q&A into the deck for any of the questions that we couldn't answer here. So when it's published, you get the answers. Maybe I need to share this with everybody. It's a pretty weak coffee now. Well, thank you. Thanks very much.